I've always loved that cottage more than anything else I've ever owned. It wasn't just a house by the lake. It was where my parents took me every summer, where I learned to fish, where the fireflies seemed to dance just for us. Every creak in the floorboards, every crack in the dock, every faded photograph on the walls held a memory I could never replace. So when my nephew walked in last weekend, grinning like he owned the place already, my stomach sank. He leaned against the railing, stretching out casually, and said, "You know, this place would make a killer Airbnb. I could handle the bookings, clean up the place, and..." My blood ran cold. I froze mid-sip of my coffee, unable to mask the shock. How could he even think that? Did he not see the sentimental value? The years of memories stitched into every corner? I could feel a surge of anger bubbling, the kind that made your hands clench without realizing it. Betrayal was sharp and immediate, slicing through the air between us, and yet part of me had to stay calm. He didn't even realize what he was messing with. If he thought he could just turn our family's legacy into a cash grab, he was sorely mistaken. My mind raced, calculating, simmering. This wasn't just about a property. It was about respect, boundaries, and the principle that some things were not for sale. I let a faint smile slip across my face, the kind that didn't reveal just how furious I was, because patience would be my secret weapon. Let him talk himself into thinking he had an idea. Let him bask in his imagined victory. He had no clue what was coming. And as I watched him pace the deck, completely oblivious, I felt the first spark of a plan ignite. A plan that would teach him that some family treasures were not to be trifled with. Every syllable he spoke about optimizing profits only deepened my resolve. He thought he was clever. He thought he had it all figured out. But he had underestimated me completely. The cottage would remain untouched, and by the time he realized it, it would be too late. My heart pounded with a mixture of love for the place and the righteous anger I now carried. And I knew one thing for certain. This weekend would set the stage for everything that was about to come. As I sat on the porch swing, staring out over the lake, I couldn't shake the pattern I'd seen for years. This wasn't the first time he'd put money above family, and it hurt more than I expected. I remembered the time he borrowed my car for a week and returned it with a dent he claimed wasn't a big deal, yet never offered to fix it. Then there was my sister's wedding, when he insisted on sitting out front of the ceremony because the photographer told him he wouldn't be in the main shots. He said he needed better lighting for Instagram. I had laughed it off back then, chalking it up to youthful arrogance, but looking at him now, I saw the same greed, the same entitlement magnified. Even minor incidents, like taking my grandmother's vintage silverware for a quick loan and forgetting to return it, added up over time. He had a history of treating family like a convenience store, always there when he wanted something, absent when someone needed him. The realization stung harder than I expected, mixing disappointment with a growing anger I couldn't contain. My memories of him flaunting opportunities at the expense of others built a clear picture. He had never truly respected what was ours. Every childhood birthday he dismissed, every careless comment about inheritance or privilege, all of it now clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to finish. And now, standing here with him casually plotting to monetize the cottage, I felt a familiar pang of betrayal, sharper than the time he had taken the last slice of cake at my birthday party without asking. It wasn't just about greed, it was about disregard, the assumption that he could take without consequence. I breathed deeply, letting the anger settle into resolve. I would not let history repeat itself. He needed a lesson, and I knew I had the patience and foresight to deliver it perfectly. Every slight, every past selfish act, now fueled the fire of the plan forming quietly in my mind. This wasn't just a cottage anymore. It was a test of boundaries, a stage for justice. He thinks I'm oblivious, I told myself the first time I replayed his words. Let him think that. Let him believe I was the soft, sentimental aunt who kept the cottage for memories and never for business. That image would be my greatest advantage. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, sunlight slanting through the blinds, and started to outline possibilities like a chess player lining up moves. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about preserving what mattered and teaching a lesson without making a spectacle of myself. My first rule was subtlety. I would not accuse, not yet. Accusations make people defensive, and defensive people make mistakes that reveal who they really are. Instead, I decided to make him reveal himself, publicly or legally, so the truth would come from his own mouth. If he wanted to monetize the cottage, he should meet the consequences without me having to raise my voice. I wrote small casual questions I could drop into conversations about permits, insurance, the deed, who would be responsible when guests broke a window, and practiced saying them like an ordinary, curious relative. Then I mapped allies. There were cousins who still remembered my father's terrible jokes and Sundays when the boat motor sputtered. Those were people who held memories like talismans. Remind them of one evening and they'd defend the cottage like it was theirs. I planned to send a few old photos, mention specific summers, and let nostalgia do its work. Social pressure is a quiet weapon. People behave differently when reminded of shared history and collective memory. I could see it already. A cousin's protective text, an aunt's indignant phone call. Tiny currents that would shift the conversation away from profit. I also looked for practical levers. I wasn't a lawyer, but I could learn enough to make a point. The next morning, I walked into the county clerk's office with a friendly smile and a pretend curiosity. I asked about short-term rentals and whether any properties were exempt due to family trust language or historic designation. The clerk mentioned quirks and caveats, and I wrote each one down. Words like restriction, trust clause, and zoning variance felt heavy in my notebook, but they'd sound casual and ominous when I dropped them into a family conversation. At night, I rehearsed scenes in my head until they felt natural. I pictured him standing on the dock, chest puffed, explaining how easy it would be to take bookings. I pictured myself smiling, then dropping a line about the clause your grandfather insisted on, as casually as commenting on the weather. I imagined his face when entitlement met friction, that tiny falter of confidence that shows arrogance for what it is. Those rehearsals steadied me and sharpened the edges of the plan. I could almost see the moment his confidence thinned. I planned contingencies. If he hired a contractor, I had someone ready to ask about permits and historic assessments. If he listed the cottage, a friend could flag the listing and pose as a concerned neighbor. If he tried to rope in family members, I would share a memory that felt intimate and sincere, nudging them to question his motives. Each move was designed to escalate gently, to let the consequences unfurl like dominoes rather than a sudden collapse. I wanted him to trip over his own assumptions and watch the fallout be entirely of his own making. As the plan took shape, anger cooled into a precise satisfaction. I wasn't scheming to humiliate him cruelly. I was defending a legacy and restoring a boundary he had thought fluid. I folded the legal pad, slid it into a drawer, and listened to the lake outside where the moon traced a bright path. This was no longer a private annoyance. It had become a quiet campaign that required patience, timing, and a little theater. He still had no idea what he was up against, and that was the point. In the days that followed, I moved like a careful gardener, pruning and planting in equal measure, watching reactions, tweaking the plan. Every casual question and nostalgic photo was a small test. I knew one misstep could turn strategy into spectacle, so I kept my movements deliberate and unseen. I said I was just checking the pipes, an excuse so ordinary he barely looked up. He was glued to his phone, sketching listing ideas and muttering about aesthetics. "We could do white linens and a welcome basket," he said, reciting a script. His voice held no memory of summers spent here. I kept my face neutral and let him talk. People reveal themselves when they're certain no one is listening. He rattled off words that belonged to spreadsheets: occupancy, peak season, cleaning fees. "Give me a couple weeks and I'll have it polished," he said. He used "we" like we'd signed a partnership, not like we were family. I asked casual, "Have you looked into local permits?" He blinked, annoyed. "It's fine," he said. "I'll handle it." His dismissal was a small victory, arrogance visible. I wandered the cottage, letting my fingers trace the banister, and noting the intimate things he saw as inventory. My mother's quilt lay folded on the guest bed, each square a stitched story. The coffee table bore a groove where my brother had sharpened a knife. Postcards from old friends lined the sill. These were not props. They were the scaffolding of our lives. I moved a photograph a fraction, shifted a postcard, small actions that would matter later. He stood on the dock and painted a picture of selfie-friendly sunsets and curated breakfasts. "Think of the reviews," he said. 5 stars. Everyone will want a weekend here. His talk was all surface, designed to sell. I sat with my feet over the water and said softly, "My grandfather kept a clause in the deed. He was protective of this place." He shrugged, impatient. "Old men and their paperwork," he muttered. His dismissal underscored his underestimation. He measured the guest room, rolling his eyes at a hand-lettered sign that read, "Please remove muddy shoes." Who still cares about signs like that? He asked. The laugh stung. It was the same disdain he'd used before when taking things for granted. I asked, steady, "Do you know who else might care?" He frowned, curiosity briefly replacing his confidence. I ran into a neighbor walking their dog and mentioned the old regatta, the night of the meteor shower. The neighbor's face softened, protective lines appearing. "Oh, that place," they said, like an oath. I watched their eyes shift to the cottage as if guarding it. Little by little, I seeded memories around other people, letting a communal sense of ownership tighten. Before I left, I tucked a single, unobtrusive note beneath outdoor magazines on the porch table. It read, "Check deed restrictions, grandfather's trust clause," phrased like a cautious tip, not an accusation. From the kitchen window, I watched him find it, skim it, then toss it aside with a scoff. His contempt told me he felt secure enough to ignore a warning. He didn't notice the neighbor watching from across the lane. I walked the property one last time, touching weathered stones and the old picnic table, feeling the weight of the place under my palms. He thought he had taken the first step toward ownership, but the cottage was more than a business opportunity. It was a ledger of love and history, and I had already begun to rewrite the margins without him knowing. As I drove away, the plan clicked into place. Small moves, public memories, legal nudges, all calibrated so his certainty might collapse on its own. I doubled back twice during the visit, pretending to check the shed, but really leaving tiny breadcrumbs. A printed query about zoning on the counter, a business card tucked inside a magazine, a tablet screen bookmarked to short-term rental restrictions. Each clue was ordinary enough to be brushed off, but odd enough to be remembered. Later, when he boasted to a friend about bookings, the friend mentioned the note in passing, asking if the cottage was even eligible for short-term rentals. His face flickered, confidence wobbling for a heartbeat. It planted doubt quietly, enough doubt. At the next family dinner, I brought up the cottage as casually as I could, letting it roll into conversation like an afterthought. "It's been such a busy summer at the lake," I said, sipping my tea. "I wonder if anyone's thought about small rentals while we're away." My nephew's head snapped up immediately, a grin spreading across his face as if I'd just handed him a golden opportunity. "Oh, I've been thinking," he said too eagerly. "I could totally set it up as an Airbnb. I've got ideas for bookings, decor, and marketing." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression calm, letting the words sink in as my mind cataloged every syllable. I watched the table shift subtly. Cousins exchanged glances, some eyebrows raising. Aunts and uncles murmured, half interested, half wary, as though the air carried tension they weren't sure how to address. "That sounds ambitious," one cousin said, uncertain, while another added, "You'd have to get permits, right?" I smiled faintly, pretending ignorance but mentally checked each reaction. The way their eyes flitted from him to me, weighing the propriety of his plan, confirmed the social pressure was building without anyone having to say it outright. He launched into a long explanation about potential earnings, guest experiences, and themed weekends. I listened quietly, taking mental notes, the tiniest smirk playing at the corner of my lips. Each boast, each overconfident gesture, reinforced his arrogance. He thought he was charming the room, selling the dream, but I saw the cracks. Some relatives were uneasy, sensing that turning family property into a business venture wasn't quite right. Others were curious, but their curiosity carried an undercurrent of doubt. I asked small, casual questions. Have you thought about insurance for accidental damage? What about maintenance during the off-season? Each inquiry was mild, conversational, but each forced him to articulate specifics he hadn't considered. The pauses, the half-smiles, the stammering. These were tiny victories, a subtle exposure of his overconfidence. The moral tension in the room thickened. Some relatives leaned forward, intrigued by the possibilities. Others leaned back, protective, silently questioning his entitlement. As he continued, unaware of the scrutiny, I cataloged every word in my mind, every gesture and response. He didn't see me take note of every word he said, I thought, a quiet thrill running through me. These words, these boasts, would later be part of a carefully orchestrated plan. The table's energy hummed with unspoken judgments and social friction, the perfect environment to let his arrogance build while I quietly measured every angle. By the time dessert was served, I felt a surge of anticipation. I knew exactly where the weaknesses in his confidence lay, and soon, he would discover that underestimating me was his gravest mistake. The first opportunity came sooner than I expected. While casually flipping through some old cottage papers, I spotted it. A small clause tucked away in the deed, a condition my grandfather had insisted on decades ago. It stated, in legalese so dry it almost disguised its power, that the property could not be used for commercial short-term rentals without unanimous family consent. My heart raced as I realized the leverage it offered. This wasn't confrontation. It was strategy. He had no idea this clause existed, and I intended to let it speak for itself. I waited until he was enthusiastically discussing listing ideas with a cousin over lunch. "I've already thought about the rental calendar," he boasted. I smiled faintly and mentioned, as if in passing, "I was reviewing the deed last night." "Did you know there's a clause about commercial use without family approval?" His words froze midair. The grin faltered. His confidence wavered. "Oh, that's probably outdated," he said quickly, trying to sound casual, but the sharp edge of doubt had crept into his voice. The cousin's expressions shifted too. Eyes darted between him and me, sensing the tension. A few leaned forward, intrigued, while others exchanged subtle whispers. The room felt smaller, charged with a quiet electricity as the implications settled. He sputtered through a few justifications, suggesting loopholes, online research, or hypothetical permissions, but each response only underscored his unpreparedness. I didn't need to argue. The deed spoke louder than any protest. He had built his entire plan on assumed control, and now that foundation showed cracks. Every casual question I dropped, about zoning restrictions or trust approvals, was like a gentle prod, teasing the realization he had overlooked. I watched him bite his lip, flustered but trying to mask it, and felt a surge of satisfaction. The beauty of this move wasn't in confrontation. It was in subtlety. I had let him expose his own ignorance, turning his arrogance against him. He had entered the room thinking he held all the cards, and now, for the first time, he realized he might be missing some very important ones. I kept my tone neutral, letting him wrestle with the information while I remained the calm, almost indifferent aunt. Inside, though, I was exhilarated. This was just the first domino, and the anticipation of what would come next made my pulse quicken. He had underestimated me, and that underestimation would be the key to everything that followed. He stood at the head of the living room, arms crossed, laying out every detail of his Airbnb dream, as if he had already signed contracts, painted walls, and booked guests. He described themed weekends, breakfast baskets, peak season pricing, and even suggested charging extra for lakefront views. I nodded politely, careful to keep my expression neutral, letting him believe he had my attention, while my mind burned with suppressed frustration. Outwardly calm, I sipped my tea and listened. But inside, my emotions churned, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and the sharp sting of betrayal. As he spoke, memories surfaced, unbidden. I remembered schlepping furniture up to the cottage alone during my first summer back after college, when money was tight and every dollar counted. I recalled painting the walls in the heat of July, sealing cracks in the dock with my own hands, and cleaning every inch of the place so it could remain a sanctuary for family summers. Each sacrifice, every hour spent caring for the cottage, flashed before me in vivid detail, making the audacity of his entitlement sting even more, sharply. I caught myself imagining the place transformed into a commercial space under his command, strangers, traipsing through rooms filled with our family history, turning private memories into a profit. My chest tightened, the kind of emotional squeeze that left you quiet and seething at the same time. I thought of nights spent worrying about maintenance, balancing the costs, and making the cottage welcoming without a thought of personal gain. And here he was, standing over my memories as though they were trivial, eager to monetize something I had poured my heart into. I asked measured, gentle questions about logistics, almost casual. How would you handle repairs if something breaks? What about insurance coverage for the historic features? He brushed them off with a wave, insisting he'd figure it out. Each dismissal deepened my resolve. I let it pass like a breeze, but inside, I was building momentum. The tension between his arrogance and my simmering determination filled the room silently, like an unspoken duel. Every boast he made, every confident claim about guests and bookings, only reinforced my plan. I imagined him discovering the hidden clause in the deed, feeling the sudden weight of the responsibilities he had so carelessly ignored. My mind replayed each memory of personal investment, turning them into stakes that made the inevitable confrontation even more satisfying. He thought he had the upper hand, but in reality, I was in control. And the anticipation of his eventual realization made the simmering anger within me feel almost electric. I wandered through the cottage with a casual air, pretending to straighten cushions and dust shelves, while mentally ticking off the subtle reminders I could leave behind. On the kitchen counter, I placed a small stack of papers, casually marked with questions about permits and local regulations. Interesting, I murmured aloud, flipping through them just enough for him to notice. He glanced over my shoulder, smirking, confident that these were trivial details, unaware that every word I had written was a breadcrumb, leading him closer to his own unraveling. In the living room, I nudged a photo frame slightly to the side and commented, "Funny, I didn't realize this picture was in the deed records." He chuckled dismissively. "Old paperwork, nobody reads that stuff." I smiled softly, letting the words hang. Let him feel clever while the seeds of doubt took root. I could see him pacing the deck, talking through Airbnb layouts to himself, and I knew he was walking right into my little web. Outside, I placed a magazine open to an article about local zoning quirks and casually remarked, "Some towns are surprisingly picky about rentals." His eyes flicked briefly, then he laughed. "I've got this under control," he said, brushing it off. That laugh made my pulse quicken. Arrogance was a powerful thing when it blinded someone to the truth. I let him feel that confidence. It made the eventual collapse even sweeter. I also dropped a tiny note into the guest book, just enough to be found when he wandered in later. It read, "Check deed restrictions. Grandfather's clause might apply." Small, unobtrusive, seemingly innocent, but a critical part of the setup. My internal monologue ran through every angle. He would see it, ignore it, and then slowly the implications would dawn. I wandered the dock, pretending to admire the sunset, and muttered aloud, "Imagine if someone didn't realize the rules about commercial use here." He stopped, glanced at me, then shook his head. "Rules, schmules. I've got everything handled." I let the words slip past, tension coiling like a spring. Each of these small, accidental reminders was a string I could pull at the right moment. By the time I left, I had laid out a trail of hints, casual statements, and minor provocations that would make him question himself without me ever having to confront him directly. He didn't see the pattern yet, but the cottage itself was now a stage, the clues like actors waiting for their cues. Every glance, every comment, every subtle placement was a part of the plan, and I couldn't help but feel a thrill of satisfaction. The perfect setup was complete, and soon, he would realize too late that he had been walking into my trap all along. A week later, he announced he had scheduled a contractor to inspect the cottage for Airbnb readiness. I listened with quiet amusement, nodding as he rattled off dates, times, and imagined renovations. I let him think this was all moving smoothly, all under his control. What he didn't realize was that I had already contacted the county office and neighbors, subtly planting awareness about the deed clause and zoning restrictions. By the time the contractor arrived, a few unexpected questions and hesitations had already been sown in the right ears. He led the contractor through the house, gesturing grandly, explaining imagined layouts and potential guest activities. We'd need 3 bedrooms staged, white linens, themed decorations. He prattled. The contractor listened politely, but I could see the flicker of doubt crossing his face as he glanced at the deed and property files I had left casually on the counter. Have you checked these restrictions?" he asked, and my nephew's confident smile faltered, replaced by a nervous laugh. "Oh, they're probably fine," he muttered, a little too quickly. I observed him pacing, unaware that each boast, each assumption, and each skipped verification was setting him up. The neighbors, who I had subtly reminded of the family's intent and the deed clause, lingered nearby under the guise of casual visits. Their curious glances and polite questions compounded his unease, each one a quiet prod. He had imagined admiration, not scrutiny. Even when he called family members to boast about future bookings, I had preemptively mentioned the clause and regulations in passing. Suddenly, he was answering questions he had ignored, justifying plans that weren't legal, and fumbling explanations while maintaining a forced grin. The contrast between his projected confidence and the real-world obstacles created a tension he didn't yet recognize. I stayed silent, letting the situation escalate naturally, savoring the dramatic irony. Each misstep, each flustered answer, each moment of hesitation was a small victory. He had built his own trap with arrogance and assumptions, and I was merely the observer, guiding it silently. The suspense hung thick in the air. The payoff was imminent, and he had no idea that the carefully orchestrated chain of events was about to deliver the lesson he had so arrogantly ignored. The day finally came when the plan could no longer remain quiet. I invited him over under the pretense of reviewing the Airbnb details one last time, letting him believe he had momentum, that he was on the cusp of victory. He arrived with the same smug grin, carrying his tablet full of projected earnings, guest lists, and floor plans. I poured tea, sat across from him, and let the room fill with a silence that felt heavier than any words. "So," I began casually, "I spoke with the county office yesterday about short-term rentals." His eyes lit up, and he leaned forward, expecting praise or approval. I didn't give it. "They mentioned some restrictions that apply to properties held in trust," I continued, letting each word drop slowly, deliberately. His confident posture wavered slightly. "Restrictions? What kind of restrictions?" he asked, trying to mask nervousness with curiosity. I smiled faintly and reached for the deed, flipping to the clause my grandfather had insisted on. "Here it is," I said softly. He leaned closer, scanning the words, and I watched the color drain from his face as realization struck. Every imagined weekend getaway, every curated basket, every dollar he thought he would make, all of it hinged on a condition he had ignored. I let the moment stretch, savoring his silent panic. Then came the neighbor, knocking at the door with a polite smile. "I just wanted to check in about the property. I heard someone might be renting it short-term." Their presence added weight, a subtle social confirmation that this wasn't just a technicality. It was a community expectation, a line he had crossed in imagination, if not yet in action. He stammered, fumbling excuses, words tumbling over each other. I didn't intervene. The truth had become its own force.